On December 21st, 1978, police in Chicago were urgently searching for a missing teenager. Their investigation led them to the home of a local maintenance contractor. When they executed the search warrant, they entered the crawl space, and within the very first shovel of earth, they uncovered human remains. The man in custody was 36-year-old John Wayne Gacy, a well-known community figure who spent weekends dressed as a clown, entertaining children. At one point, he told detectives chillingly, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." And he had. Over a 5-year period, Gacy had tortured and killed 33 young men. 27 of their bodies were buried beneath his own home. Inflicting pain, suffering, and torture on helpless victims, that is the essence of evil. And John Wayne Gacy showed no remorse. Over 6 years, he kidnapped, tortured, and murdered 33 boys and young men in and around Chicago. It remains one of the most shocking crime sprees in American history. But Gacy's story began decades earlier. He was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942. The second of 3 children, his upbringing was difficult. His father, an alcoholic, was reportedly both mentally and physically abusive to his wife and children. Gacy spent his childhood being demeaned, beaten, and told he was stupid and worthless. Barry Roscelli, a childhood friend, recalled the abuse. If Johnny was 2 minutes late, he wouldn't be fed. He often ate and slept at Barry's house. Barry remembered Gacy's father hitting him in the face while he sat at the kitchen table. Gacy's father was a central figure in the formation of his violent pathology. Gacy seemed desperate to earn his approval, but never could. He was beaten with belts, brooms, and once knocked unconscious. People who grew up in such environments often develop a warped view of human relationships, seeing them not as built on love or trust, but on exploitation and cruelty. Gacy was also a sickly child. A heart condition kept him from participating in sports, further isolating him from his peers. At age 11, a playground accident left him with recurring blackouts and frequent hospital visits. He was struck in the forehead by a heavy wooden swing and knocked to the ground. By 1966, Gacy was 24, married and living in Waterloo, Iowa, 300 miles west of Chicago. From the outside, his life looked normal. He had a good job, a wife, 2 children. He was active in local chambers of commerce and well regarded in the community. But beneath the surface, Gacy was hiding a dark secret. He had developed an unhealthy sexual interest in young boys. One of his first known assaults was on the son of a fellow JC member. Gacy lured the boy to his home and sexually assaulted him, abusing his position of trust. When the boy told his father, Gacy was arrested. He then hired another teenager to intimidate the victim, luring him to a remote location, spraying mace in his eyes, beating him, and warning him not to testify. Despite this, the boy did testify, but with limited evidence. Gacy was only charged with one account of sodomy involving the 15-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty, expecting a light sentence. Instead, the judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. On December 3rd, 1968, Gacy was sent to Anamiso State Penitentiary. While incarcerated, his wife divorced him. His father died, and Gacy was denied permission to attend the funeral. True to form, Gacy quickly manipulated his way into favor. Within months, he became head cook and convinced staff he was reformed. And, persuaded the parole board, he posted no threat. He served just 18 months of his 10-year sentence. In June 1970, now 28, Gacy returned to Chicago. His criminal past was unknown to friends, family, and neighbors. He started his own business. No background checks, no scrutiny. In 1972, he married again and moved to 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Chicago suburbs. The house would later become one of the most infamous addresses in America. 6 years later, in December 1978, 15-year-old Rob Priest disappeared just 10 miles from Gacy's home. Rob had told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Detectives Mike Alberich and Dave Heistermeister began investigating. Rob was a standout kid, bright, responsible, never in trouble. His disappearance was deeply out of character. No signs of drug use, no girlfriend issues, no reason to run away. He was a kind of kid anyone would be proud to call their son. That's what made his disappearance so alarming. At the time of his disappearance, Rob Priest was working at a pharmacy in Des Pines, Illinois. He mentioned to a co-worker and to his mother that he had planned to speak with a contractor about a potential job. He stepped out the back door of the store and was never seen again. It was as if Rob had vanished into thin air. Detectives urgently needed to identify the contractor he'd gone to meet, likely the last person to see him alive. Their search led them to a 36-year-old man named John Wayne Gacy. Recently divorced, Gacy was running a successful business called PDM Contractors. He frequently hired teenage boys, included one named Tommy Anatolian. Tony was just 16 when he met Gacy. Like many teens, he was eager to earn money to help pay for a car. His first impression of Gacy was positive. He seemed jovial, approachable, even fun. Gacy came across as a kind of boss who might suggest knocking off early on a Sunday afternoon to enjoy the day. It all felt normal, harmless. But Rob had also gone to meet Gacy about a job, and he hadn't come back. Detectives began digging into Gacy's background. What they found was alarming. Gacy had a prior conviction of sodomy in Idaho, sexual crimes involving minors. Concerned about this history, police secured a warrant to search Gacy's home. The warrant was based on three key facts. Gacy had been at the pharmacy the night Rob disappeared. Rob had told others he was meeting a contractor, and Gacy had a criminal record involving sexual offences against children. On December 13th, 1978, police executed their first search of Gacy's home. What they found raised serious red flags. There were pornographic materials, books with disturbing titles like Pretty Boys Must Die, and several driver's licenses belonging to young men. A check revealed that many of these individuals had been reported missing. Initially, investigators held out hope that Rob Priest might still be alive, but that hope faded quickly. Amongst the items recovered was a high school ring belonging to 19-year-old John Skisk, who had disappeared in January 1977. Further investigation revealed that two of Gacy's former employees, 17-year-old John Butaski and Gregory Godsix, had also gone missing in 1975 and 1976, respectively. As the case evolved, detectives began to suspect that Gacy was connected to at least 5 or 6 disappearances, but without physical evidence, no bodies. They couldn't make an arrest. Instead, they launched round-the-clock surveillance. Their approach was simple. Wherever Gacy went, they followed. If he entered a public space, they went in too. Over time, a strange dynamic developed. Casey knew he was being watched, and he leaned into it, initiating conversation, trying to charm the officers. He toyed with them. Once he approached their car and casually asked if they wanted some marijuana. Another time he entered the Moose Lodge, and the detectives followed, sitting at a separate table. Moments later, a waitress delivered 2 beers to them, saying, "They're from that gentleman over there." Gacy raised his hands in greetings. They waved back. He was confident, cocky, always bragging about his business, his properties, and his connections. But beneath that bravado, the walls were closing in. John Wayne Gacy had a psychopathic personality. He craved power, thrived on control, and enjoyed manipulating those around him. He was, in many ways, a puppet master, pulling strings, playing roles, and hiding behind charm. That need for dominance seemed to drive his behavior. Everyone had nothing but praise for Gacy, neighbors, co-workers, and associates. They all liked him. The way he interacted during surveillance was no different. He was friendly, engaging, even likable. But the two detectives had to keep reminding each other, this man is dangerous. In his community, Gacy was seen as a model citizen. He was active in local politics and well connected and popular. On weekends, he dressed as a clown, Pogo the Clown. and performed at children's parties and hospitals. But there was something deeply unsettling about that persona. Most clowns paint soft, rounded smiles. Gacy's was sharp, winged, almost bat-like. It gave Pogo a sinister edge, transforming him from the entertainer to something monstrous. That image elevated Gacy to the level of mythic American villain. At one point, he told detectives, clowns can get away with murder, and he had. But it took time for investigators to fully grasp the scale of what he was capable of. While Mike and Dave continued surveillance, detectives at the station were working on securing a second search warrant for Gacy's home. New information had come to light, disturbing details from his employees. Several young men, aged 17 to 19, recalled being ordered into a crawl space beneath Gacy's home to dig trenches. Gacy claimed it was for a sewage issue, but they said it happened multiple times, and the smell down there was overwhelming. That's when the questions started to shift. Could he have buried someone down there? Gacy had a way of involving others in his crimes without their knowledge. They seemed to be part of a thrill, exerting control over people who had no idea what they were part of. He hid in plain sight, and no one connected the dots. Mike and Dave kept up surveillance, but they also began applying pressure. Gacy had a strong support network, friends, family, co-workers, and that loyalty was shielding him. So investigators started targeting that circle, slowly peeling away people. At the same time, they fed Gacy information suggesting a second search warrant might be imminent. He began to unravel. On the first night of surveillance around midnight, Gacy contacted his attorneys and met them at their office in Park Ridge. Mike and Dave were outside when the attorney waved them in, an unusual move and one that signaled a shift. The moment Gacy left his attorney's office, things escalated. The first instruction they got was clear: park in front of his house and don't let him leave. If he tries to run, shoot out his tires. That's when he realized something serious had just happened. Inside the office, the attorneys were visibly shaken, pacing, tense, eyes locked on Gacy. It was obvious they were terrified. That told them everything they needed to know. Gacy had confessed to them at least 2 or 3 murders. Mike and Dave continued to follow him as he left. He was driving erratically, speeding through the streets until he reached a Shell station where he regularly did business. Inside, they watched him interact with the employee, hugging, shaking hands, unusually emotional. It was a lot of contact for Gacy. When he left, the 2 detectives went inside. The employees handed them 2 bags of marijuana and said, "We didn't buy this. We didn't ask for it. Gacy just gave it to us." His behavior was spiraling. That drug transaction gave us the opening we needed. We made the call to arrest him. Right there, Devin and Rocky. That was the last moment of Gacy's freedom. They pulled him from the car. He whined. "Why are you doing this to me?" But it was over. Technically, he was arrested for possession and delivery of marijuana. He was taken to the station. While in custody, Gacy complained of chest pains and was taken to the hospital as a precaution. But it was a delay tactic. Meanwhile, the second search warrant had come through. On December 21st, 1978, police returned to Gacy's home on West Somerdale Avenue. This time, they went straight into the crawl space. The first shovel of earth revealed human remains. Gacy's secret, buried for years, had finally been unearthed. He said he wanted to confess, but not to the detectives. He wanted to confess to the surveillance team. He wanted an audience again. He knew the game was up, and now he was ready to talk. He offered to draw a map of the burial sites beneath his home. He was handed a pen, and he began sketching. He marked doubles, triples, and individual graves. He placed X's where each body had been buried. Investigators dug with spoons, anything they could find, and when they overlaid his diagram with the actual burial sites, it matched perfectly. In total, 27 bodies were recovered from the crawl space. News of the discovery spread quickly. Headlines filled the local newspapers reporting how many bodies had been pulled from Gacy's basement. With the full scope of his crimes exposed, Gacy's entered the record books as America's most prolific serial killer at the time. The idea that this pudgy, ordinary man had been living in a house filled with death, torturing boys in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. Heading off to work the next day was almost too much to comprehend. When they finally booked him for murder, he was asked where was he born. He looked at us and said, "I was born in a state of confusion." Then he smiled. Gacy confessed to killing 33 boys and young men between 1972 and 1978. He targeted victims who were vulnerable: runaways, homeless teens, kids with no one to miss them. In the late 70s, many of these boys were reported missing, but there was little follow-up. He buried 27 of them in a crawl space, one in his backyard, and when he ran out of room, he dumped 5 more in the Des Plaines River. One of his bodies, found floating in April 1979, was Rob Priest, the 15-year-old who disappeared, who had started it all. Gacy was disturbingly detailed when describing what he did to Rob Priest. Rob's mother had been waiting for him in the pharmacy parking lot. Rob told her, "I'm just going to go talk to a contractor about a job. I'll be right back." He stepped inside, and Gacy was waiting in the alley behind the store. As Gacy began to leave, Rob approached him and said, "Excuse me, sir. I heard you hire young guys. I'm really interested in getting a job." Gacy invited him into the car, saying he would fill out the application. Rob got in willingly. Gacy drove him to his home. Once there, Gacy began showing Rob a few clown tricks, card tricks, sleight of hand. Then came the handcuff trick. Gacy cuffed himself, turned around, struggled, then turned back and held up the cuffs. Rob was impressed. "That's neat. How will you do that?" Gacy handed him the cuffs. "Here, you try. I'll show you." Rob locked the cuff on himself and struggled. "What's the trick?" he said. Gacy reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and said, "The trick is, you've got to have this." The handcuff trick was part of Gacy's horrific and calculated method. Over the course of 33 murders, he developed a routine. He lured victims, some were employees, but most were teenage runaways. He'd bring them home, offer drinks, and trick them into being handcuffed. He used chloroform to subdue them. Then came what he called the rope trick. He'd slip a knotted loop around their neck, insert a stick at the back like a tourniquet, and slowly twist. He claimed he had perfected it, knew exactly how the body would react with each half turn. Medically, a ligature like that cuts off blood flow to the brain. It's painful, disorientated, and can cause unconsciousness in seconds. Gacy described how he tortured his victims. Sometimes he'd incapacitate them, 2 or 3 at once, killing one in front of the other before continuing. He seemed proud of it. That pride kept him talking. He described every murder in detail, all 33. As the news spread, one viewer was especially shaken. Tony, a former employee who had unknowingly survived Gacy's MO. While working for PDM, Tommy injured his foot with a nail. Gacy took him for a tetanus shot, then brought him home. Later that evening, Gacy returned with wine. They drank, joked around. It was late, around 10:30 p.m. Tony was a high school wrestler. Gacy teased him, saying, "You're a big wrestler guy." I began playfully grappling with him. He got Tony's left arm behind his back and locked on a handcuff. Tony resisted, flailing his right arm, but Gacy eventually got both wrists and forced him to the floor. Then he left the room. Tony realized he could pull his right hand free. He did, but pretending it was still cuffed. When Gacy returned, Tony turned the tables. He cuffed Gacy's wrist, reached into his pocket for the key, and locked both of Gacy's hands behind his back. Gacy said, "You're the only one who's not only got out of my handcuffs, you've got them on me." Tony didn't know what he meant. He thought it was some kind of test. He left Gacy cuffed for 10 to 15 minutes, then let him go. Gacy had agreed to leave, and he did. Tony had no idea how close he had come to being another victim. He later said, "I didn't fear for my life, and not panicking probably saved me. If I'd tried to run, he could have overpowered me." He was 33, strong. I was just 16 or 17. Tony continued working for PDM for a few months after that incident. He only reported it after Gacy's arrest. By the time the case went to trial, Police had identified the remains of 22 victims, but the forensic scene was a nightmare. Around 30 bodies, all in different stages of decomposition. Some had been buried for years. Excavating that crawl space was a massive, complex operation. It took time, manpower, and precision. 7 victims were never identified. The community on the outskirts of Chicago were stunned. No one could believe that such a monster had lived among them. For many, learning about these crimes triggered a kind of childhood terror. You can imagine the shock. Middle class families watching authorities pull decomposing bodies from a crawl space of a neighbour's home. The public reaction to John Wayne Gacy's crimes was one of horror and outrage. A man once held in high regard by his community had committed atrocities that defied belief. As the state prepared its case, prosecutors were determined to ensure that Gacy would be held fully accountable. His trial began on February 6, 1980, at the Cook County Criminal Courts building in Chicago. At the time, Illinois still enforced the death penalty. Gacy's defense team entered a plea of insanity. It was a complex trial. Multiple psychiatrists testified, each offering different diagnoses. Their conflicting opinions painted a fragmented picture of Gacy, a man whose psychological makeup seemed to have broken into pieces. Over 5-week proceedings, the prosecution worked relentlessly to prove that Gacy was fully responsible for his actions. There is a critical distinction between mental illness and psychopathy. Psychopaths are rational. They understand what they are doing. They know it's wrong, and they choose to do it anyway. Gacy fit that profile. He was calculated, vicious, and entirely aware of his crimes. He didn't kill out of impulse. He killed to protect his image. Politically and professionally, he was well liked. He couldn't afford to be exposed to someone who preyed on vulnerable boys, so he silenced them. One of the prosecution's key witnesses was Tony, the former employee who had narrowly escaped becoming one of Casey's victims. Tony recalls seeing Gacy in court, seated at the defense table, staring straight ahead. They may have locked eyes once or twice, but Tony was nervous. He was in his early 20s, testifying in one of the most significant trials of a decade. On March 13, 1980, the jury reached its verdict. It took less than 3 hours to find Gacy's guilt. The speed of the decision was striking, especially compared to other high-profile trials. In the final moments, prosecution William Knuckle described Gacy as a ruthless, sadistic killing machine. It was a fitting label. Judge Louis B. Garpoi sentenced Gacy to death. He was transferred to Marnard Correctional Center, where he would spend the next 14 years on death row. Even behind bars, Gacy continued to manipulate. He took up painting, creating disturbing images of clowns, skulls, and other grotesque subjects. He sold them for profit, maintaining a twisted legacy through his artwork. He still had influences. He still had control. Eventually, the government sued him for earnings. Attorney Karen Conti represented Gacy in that case. She described him as a terrible painter, but people still paid hundreds of dollars for his work. When she met him, she was struck by how ordinary he seemed. He looked and acted like a friendly neighbour, like someone's uncle. And that, she said, was part of the reason he got away with so much. He didn't look evil. Karen was against the death penalty and represented Casey during his final appeals. Over the years, he exhausted every legal avenue, state and federal. By the time his execution date was set, there were no more appeals left. Some killers are so monstrous that even those who oppose capital punishment won't protest their execution. Gacy was one of them. If he had ever felt remorse, it was only for himself. He was consumed by malignant narcissism, incapable of empathy, incapable of accountability. Karen knew the odds. No court was going to commute his sentence. Politically, it was impossible. Gacy had to be executed. Even if the legal arguments were strong, no one was going to listen. Not for him. In May 1992, Gacy gave a television interview from Manor Correctional Center. He recanted his confession, claiming He was innocent, a victim of circumstance. It was nonsense. He was guilty. But what stood out was his demeanour. He was calm, composed, even indignant. "Why am I being put through this?" he asked. "It's not fair. It was pure accident. I never did it." It was his last desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative, but his original confession had been clear. He committed the murders. He acted alone. Gacy never accepted responsibility. He blamed others, his victims, their families. He insisted he wasn't at fault. Despite his efforts, on May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Penitentiary. Outside the prison, it was chaos. Crowds stretched for miles. People held signs, "Kill the clown, kill Casey, even kill Karen Conti." There were drums, dancing, clown makeup. It was a spectacle, a celebration. Gacy's final words were, "Kiss my ass." John Wayne Gacy remained unrepentant until the very end. He showed no remorse for any of his 33 victims. To use another human being to inflict pain, suffering, and torture on somebody helpless is, at its core, the definition of evil. You think that after the execution there might be closure, but there isn't, not really. You still think about the families, about 15-year-old boy who was just a good kid. As much as you want to believe there's closure, it never truly comes. 40 years after his encounter with Gacy, Tony still feels lucky to be alive. He's not sure what saved him. Maybe luck, maybe something greater. Maybe it was his own ignorance of the danger he was in. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't panic. He just wanted to win the game, if that's what it was. And that mindset might have saved his life. Tony believes he would have been one of Gacy's earlier victims, before the killer had refined his methods, before he was living alone and had the freedom to act with restraint. John Wayne Gacy remains one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. His crimes still haunted the nation. Karen Conti, who represented Gacy during his final appeals, still receives disturbing messages. People lash out, angry that she ever stood beside him in court. Gacy once told her, "Your obituary will read Karen Conti represented serial killer John Gacy," and she believes he was right. For children, monsters are real. As adults, we learn that werewolves and vampires are fictional. But then something like this happens, and suddenly the monster is real. There is an ogre. It is transfixing, horrifying, fascinating, in the worst possible way. Gacy was the embodiment of evil, but he also knew how to play the part of a great guy. That duality gave him the power to become one of the most dangerous men imaginable. His charm, his social standings, his clown persona, all of it helped him hide his crimes for over 5 years. But behind the mask was a sadistic killer, a man who tortured and murdered 33 young men in the most brutal ways imaginable, all for his own gratification. And the fact that he never showed a shred of remorse, not for his victims, not for the families, right up until the moment he was executed, leaves no doubt. John Wayne Gacy was one of the most evil killers the world has ever known. John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a permanent scar on the lives of his victims, their families, and the community that unknowingly lived beside him. His story is a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind charm, how justice, though delayed, must never be denied. If you listened this far, thank you. If you're somebody who suspects abuse, report it. This has been He Said Clowns Can Get Away with Murder. And he did. You've been listening to Disturbing Truths. I'm Andrew. Stay safe, stay aware, and stay with me. We'll be back next week with another case, another reckoning, and another story that deserves to be told.